Hi guys, it's Dan from Version 2 Poker, otherwise known as Benjamin Barker, here with an instant upgrade video. These instant upgrade videos are designed to be short classroom-style presentations to help give you guys a little bit better understanding of some common poker theory spots. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at a common situation where we flop a marginal hand and our decision is whether we want a continuation bet or check back and bluff catch. And this hand in question was sent to me by one of my students, and we had a little chat about it over Skype, and I wanted to take what we spoke about and turn it into a video because I thought it might be helpful for you guys. So hopefully you get something out of this. Alright. The scenario, the hand was played on the merge network, no limit 25, 6 max. The opponent is rather tight regular. Hero opens from middle position with A7 suited. By the way, I don't open A7 suited from MP at all tables, but it's likely fine. And the opponent calls in the big blind, and we flop second pair, good kicker. And the question becomes whether we should check or Cbet this flop. And my student thought that continuation betting was standard, but he also thought there was a lot of merit to checking back and using his hand as a bluff catcher to try to get value from all the air in our opponent's range. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the reasons for betting in general. Everyone knows the standard common reasons for betting. The most obvious is betting for value. When we bet and our opponent calls with some sort of worst made hand or draw or whatnot, and we have an equity advantage, and we're simply betting because our hand is ahead of his calling range. The other obvious reason is to bet as a bluff when we know that our hand is behind, but we're hoping that we can fold out hands that beat us by betting. And those are the two most obvious reasons, and I think everyone has a pretty good understanding of those. But beyond that, there's a lot of other reasons for betting that come up in poker, simply besides betting for value or betting as a bluff. And to just kind of list off a few of those, a common reason would be to bet to protect our equity. For example, if we had bottom pair and our opponent had two overcards to our pair, and we knew that our opponent would never call, and our opponent also is not likely to bluff us if he does not improve, we would still want to bet because there's no reason to let him get a free 6-out pull at improving and beating us. Another common reason is to bet to prevent a bluff. Sometimes we simply bet because if we check, our opponent will be in a situation where he's very commonly going to fire with most of his range and take the pot away from us. So even though we're not necessarily betting our hand for value because we expect him to kind of fold everything we beat, and we're not really betting as a bluff because we don't expect him to fold better, at the same time we're going to be fine with him just folding everything we beat and taking the pot down. And this is kind of a common situation. And other reasons would be to set up plus EV spots on future streets. That could simply be setting up a profitable barrel on the turn or the river as a bluffing opportunity. If we have a huge draw against a massive fish, we could be betting simply to bloat the pot for implied odds, to get paid off on future streets, and to create value on down the line. Certainly we can be betting in certain spots as just sort of an overall balanced approach against regulars. This really only comes into play against tough regulars at higher limits, but at the same time there's sometimes considerations in betting where we want to be betting our entire range in a certain spot and to kind of help us not get exploited by the villain or otherwise take advantage of this villain. And there's many more. These are just a few common ones, but I did kind of want to illustrate the fact that there's a lot of reasons for betting just from a theory standpoint beyond betting for value or betting simply as a bluff. So, a common question is the old adage of, well, if nothing worse calls and nothing better folds, then our bet is pretty bad. And I think that's something that a phrase a lot of players have heard. And a common situation that might illustrate this would be a hand like bottom pair. Suppose we steal on the button with 3 deuce suited and we flop bottom pair on an ace high board. When we bet here, certainly nothing worse is going to call us. It's very unlikely against most players we're just going to get floated out of position on this board, by random queen highs or such. Not to say that no one will do that, but without reads, our default assumption is that everything that we're beating folds, and if we get called, we're just behind. Yet, still, we should probably Cbet this flop. And the main reason for that is this board is definitely profitable to Cbet with air. If we just completely miss the flop with a button steal, I think most players would be Cbetting this board nearly 100% against standard tight reg type opponents with all of their air. This is kind of a good board to Cbet with air, and I think that most players understand that and would do that. So if we're able to Cbet this board with air profitably, then certainly we can bet with equity even more profitably. And really what we're doing is we're kind of treating our hand as a 5-out semi-bluff. We have 5 outs to make 2 pair or trips. And if we get called, we know that we're behind, but our hand likely has more equity than if we had bet with a total airball on this board, such as 5-6. If we raise pre-flop with 7-6 suited or something along those lines. So if we can bet this board profitably with air, it stands to reason that we can certainly Cbet this board more profitably, given that we flop some equity. And the question then becomes, is checking back really more profitable than betting on this board without solid post-flop reads? And I don't think so. On this board, I would typically bet this hand, and I'm just happy to pick the pot up on the flop. If I get called, I might be able to barrel on certain turn cards or river cards if the board runs out in certain ways. And if I hit my hand, it'll be pretty disguised. And this is a pretty common situation. And I think that most players kind of intuitively understand that they should bet on this board, and I think most players do, so this is nothing revolutionary. But it does kind of speak to the general concept of, well, nothing worse is calling, nothing better is folding. What is the purpose of our bet? And really, the purpose of our bet is not so much to get value or to bluff him off a better hand on the flop, but it's really some of the other reasons I mentioned. We could potentially be in profitable situations on the turn and river with this hand, and it is likely more profitable than checking simply to prevent our opponent from catching up and getting a free card to beat us, or from getting ideas that he wants to bluff us and fire twice because our check back range on this board is generally going to be somewhat weakened. So back to the scenario. Again, we flopped second pair on this board, and we were curious about whether we should check or bet. The other option, obviously, besides betting, is to check back and bluff catch. And when we're considering bluff catching, one thing to keep in mind is that with these type of hands, our default strategy really should be to just C-bet. When we C-bet, we're going to keep control of the hand. We're going to understand how things are going to play out. We're going to be a lot more comfortable, and we're just overall going to have a more profitable situation on our hand and a much more clear decision tree. For that reason, our default strategy really should be to C-bet, and if we adjust to bluff catching on these type of boards and checking back, really we should have a specific read and reason to do so. It shouldn't be something that we do randomly just because we kind of feel like it this time, or because we're thinking like, well, he probably can't call with worse. And by the way, on that board that we're looking at, some of you might have noticed, yeah, the villain kind of can call with worse. The villain is pretty tight pre-flop, so his calling range is narrow, but there are still flush draws or maybe an 8-7 suited type of hand in his range that he can peel with. So there is some merit to just betting strictly for value on that particular example we looked at. But anyways, we really should have a specific read and a specific reason to be adopting a bluff catching strategy against just firing what stands to be a very profitable continuation bet. If we feel like our opponent is the type that is just auto-firing turn and river anytime we check back, then bluff catching becomes a valid strategy against him, and the question then becomes, should we bluff catch with the top or the bottom or the middle of our range? And something that I see a lot of players tend to default to is betting their monster hands or their top pair hands on the flop, and then using their kind of weaker hands that they can't value bet as bluff catchers. And since we just kind of determined that it's better by default to be betting these hands, and we should only be changing our strategy to bluff catch when we have a reason to do so, when we believe our villain will just fire turn and river with his entire range as a bluff when we check back. It may be much more profitable for us to bluff catch with our top pair hands instead of our weak hands. When we check back, there's a variety of turn and river cards that can either improve our opponent or put us in a very difficult spot where calling is neutrally via best. So checking back the middle of our range, it actually kind of helps our opponent's strategy, since he's firing twice and putting us in those tough, difficult spots he's setting out to do. Whereas if we check back with a top pair type of hand, it becomes a lot easier to call down on turns and rivers. And that might be a little counterintuitive to some people, that it's actually okay versus these guys to just go ahead and bet as a semi-bluff or just a bluff with our weaker made hands or our weaker connections to the flop. And then if we do think that we should profitably be bluff catching versus someone, we could do it actually when we flop near the top of our range, and we're going to have a much easier time calling down. And then the obvious question becomes, will he exploit this? If he knows that we're doing this, obviously our betting range on the flop becomes very weak, and he can check raise bluff us a lot, and he can also just give up anytime that we check back, knowing that we likely have a top pair type of hand. And the answer is yes, he could exploit this, but without getting into a huge discussion on exploitation, anytime we're adjusting to an opponent to take advantage of something that he's doing, it inherently makes us a little bit exploitable. Against a fish, we all know that, okay, we should bet for thin value on the river, and if we're betting for super thin value on rivers against a really tough opponent, they can mix in some river bluff raises to kind of punish us for doing so. Now, against a fish, we might be exploitable by doing this super thin value betting, but the fish is obviously never going to do that. He's never going to make this adjustment. And really, against most regulars, they're not going to make complex adjustments against you either. They're just kind of playing their tables, they're playing their game, they have their strategy. That's not to say that no one adjusts, but the amount of time that it'll take him to get to enough showdowns to realize what you're doing, coupled with the fact that he might never even really catch on, at the micro stakes, this is not something that we're super concerned about. We're more concerned about adopting our strategy to exploit our opponents, and less really concerned about balance and trying to be unexploitable ourselves. So a couple last thoughts on this. I just put this up on the screen so you guys kind of remember the board in this scenario. Should we consider, if we do c-bet this flop, should we consider firing barrels against this opponent? This particular opponent was 19-18, so he has a very narrow pre-flop calling range, and especially out of position in the blinds versus our middle position open. I don't think he's defending a wide range of hands at all in that spot. If the turn was a king or a heart, I might consider triple barreling. Obviously, our betting range on that river is going to be super polarized. If the turn's a heart and we triple barrel, our betting range is mainly going to be ace-queen plus, ace-queen over pairs, flop sets, or flushes. And if the king comes and we fire 3 times, our value betting range is going to really just be top pair or better. We're probably not going to value bet ace-queen 3 times when the king hits. At least we're not going to be perceived to be. So, again, some players, if they think that you're like very aggro and they're curious and they're willing to call down light, our triple barreling range does become a little bit polarized. But against most people, when the turn is a king or a heart and you fire 3 times, you're certainly going to get them off all their second pair type hands. You're going to get them off 8-8 through Jack-Jack, the second pair pocket pairs, and you're also going to get them off, their Queen X some of the time as well. Queen Jack is going to fold. Ace Queen is even going to fold some of the time. So on those cards against this player, I might consider triple barreling. Against a looser player, I might consider double barreling. Against this guy, I don't really like double barreling because I think his flop calling range is going to be pretty strong on the whole, and I think we're a little bit too likely to get called on the turn, so I don't really like double barreling against his tight and relatively strong flop calling range. But against a looser player, first of all, they're calling pre-flop with a wider range of hands, so they have more flush draws in their range. On that board, this guy just does not have very many flush draw combos. He's not flatting out a position with a wide range of suited connectors. Against looser players, they have more flush draw combos, and they're also more apt to peel you on the flop looser. They could peel you on the flop with any pocket pair, they could have more 7x in their range, and they could even occasionally be peeling with some sort of just random like ace-high type of float. So against these looser players, this is not a terrible spot to double barrel since we're value betting against worse 7x and flush draws and protecting our hand, and we're also potentially effectively bluffing him off 8-8 through Jack-Jack type of hands. So the bet kind of serves two purposes. So, and again, there's a lot to say about what boards to barrel and what type of opponents to do it on, but I just wanted to mention a couple thoughts on this particular board in this particular situation. Something to keep in mind is when we're thinking about barreling turns and rivers, we really kind of got to keep in mind the player type we're against and their range on each street and what we expect them to do with the different portions of their range. In the future, I might do another presentation just on some barreling situations. That wasn't really the point of this video. It was more to discuss reasons for betting and the merits of turning weak flop-made hands into effective semi-bluffs as opposed to trying to use them as bluff catchers, which can get really dicey. That's it, guys. Good luck at the tables. Happy grinding. Hopefully this helped you learn something or helped you understand something a little bit better about this spot. Happy to answer any questions. And until next time, this is Dan from version2poker.com.